Hello, everybody, and welcome to Trouble. Um, I'm Joy Ladico, if you don't know me, and I'm the founder of Trouble. I've got a few internet connection problems, so I can't see any of you, but I hope you can see me. And this is, in fact, a case of what we call the new normal, what we're all doing right at the moment. The question at hand today is how we have learnt to live and unlive as a result of coronavirus. And we've got three people to address the question for us this evening. One is Jill Rutter, who is a senior fellow for the Institute of Government, although I think you might be about to move on, Jill. Bridget Phillipson, who is Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Chief Leader Writer at The Observer and The Guardian columnist, Sonia Sodha. We're going to be looking across the board at how life has changed, how your home life has changed, how work has changed, how money has changed, and how the economy has changed. So I'd like to start off by asking a question to both Bridget and Sonia, which is, our working lives have changed beyond recognition in 3 months. Is it for the better? Is it for the worse? Can we ever expect full employment again in offices?
Shall I make a start there, and I'll pass over to Sonia? I think there's quite a lot to cover with that. I think what we're living through at the moment is obviously an exceptional time and a terrible time in so many ways. I think, you know, we've seen a lot of progress in the workplace, particularly for women, and, you know, some of the emerging evidence around the impact it's having during this crisis, I think, should be a cause of concern. So the fact that women are more likely to be furloughed, that they're more likely to have lost their jobs or quit their jobs during the crisis. And I think if you look again at some of the evidence around the way in which families are splitting childcare responsibilities, again, you know, of course, these are, you know, matters for individual families, but it's unsurprising that much of the burden is falling disproportionately on women, who are seeing more of an impact on their careers and on their ability to stay in work and to get work done. I think that said, you know, there are opportunities here in that, you know, flexible working has often not been properly regarded as something that can benefit the workplace, can benefit an employer, and can allow for career development. I hope that coming through this crisis, that we start to reflect on the fact that we should value people that have different working arrangements, who have much to contribute. But again, the inequality within the pandemic is that, of course, some people are just far less able to work from home than others, and that's particularly acute in certain sectors or parts of the country. So the part of the country that I represent in the northeast is one of the regions where it's far less likely that you're far less able to be able to work from home. It's just not practical if you're, say, working on a production line, or you're in manufacturing or the chemicals industry. So, you know, the way in which this is being felt, I think, is disproportionate. So there's some good, I hope, that might be able to come out of what is a terrible time for the country. But I think there is also the real prospect that some of the progress we've made, I think, particularly for women in the workplace, could be at stake too.
Sonia, what do you make of our current working regime and how we proceed from here? What becomes allowed?
Yeah, so I would completely echo what Bridget has said about gender, and I think there are some really worrying early signs that this is a crisis that, as many would have predicted, will disproportionately impact women and women's development in the workplace. And then there are obviously huge social differentials in how people have experienced kind of the new normal in terms of work as well. So whether that's kind of having a white collar professional job where actually it's a bit of an adjustment to doing it from home, but you can do it from home. And I think there will be a real difference to people who've got children, who don't have children as well. I don't have children. My partner is actually living in New York this year. So the downside of that is I literally haven't seen anyone properly until we had a socially distanced drink with a friend. But you know, the upside is, like, I have a flat that's quiet all the time that I can work in when I want to, and I know that's what a lot of people without children don't have it. So I think there'll be that differential, but obviously there's people who simply can't work from home, so have been furloughed. And I think kind of most unjustly of all, people who work in sort of so-called key jobs, which is a really wide definition. It includes things like collecting the bins and operating public transport, and those are people who quite frankly don't have the luxury of staying at home and being safe. So I think social differentials is kind of a really, really big story in this. In terms of sort of whether I think it is quite, I think if you do a white collar professional job, it is quite hard to see kind of us going back to normal anytime soon. I know, for example, the Guardian and the Observer, I don't anticipate that many of us will actually, we figured out a way to do production of the paper completely off-site now, so it's a real skeleton staff in the office. And I can't really see sort of people being back in the office until the autumn at the earliest. So that feels like quite a big shift, I suppose. I think there's something bigger as well, which is not just in terms of style of working and where you work, but how much you work. And it just so happens for me personally that I basically chose to go down to a 3-day-a-week contract with the Guardian and the Observer in early February in order to focus on freelance work and writing a book. Not the best timing in the world, but I count myself very lucky to have a 3-day-a-week job that's well paid and that I can do from home. But personally, what I found is it's been fine doing this 3 days a week, but I've actually found it quite hard to motivate myself on the much longer term projects, just because it feels like so much is in flux and there's so much news going on. And sometimes I feel really guilty about that because I'm not being what I would sort of have counted as properly productive for 5 days a week. But then sometimes I'm like, oh, actually, maybe it's okay. Maybe it's okay to work a bit less. And I do count myself as being in an incredibly privileged position. But it's really kind of reset things for me. And so I think there are bigger questions coming out of this pandemic around how much work we do and how much leisure time we have. And that's something that I've kind of written about previously prior to this pandemic. I've made a Radio 4 programme about. But at the end of the day, you've seen Jacinda Ardern, for example, in New Zealand, sort of saying to companies, why don't you try a 4-day week? But at the end of the day, I think debates about shorter working time, I'm actually really in favour when you take a step back. There's no reason why we have to produce and consume as much as we do. I think we could be a society that has stable or even maybe slightly declining GDP, but we have other things that make our lives really rich and we really enjoy. And I do think for some people, not everyone, maybe this lockdown has kind of helped you kind of see what's important in your life. And for me, it's certainly hanging out with my friends, not going out to like overpriced restaurants all the time. But I do think this question of like shorter working time and the balance between work and leisure, it always takes you back to questions of social inequality. And the real challenge for the whole debate about the 4-day working week, for example, is, well, if you don't have really strong unions, how are you going to deliver it for low paid workers in really tough, strenuous work, who are the workers who deserve it the most? And without kind of having that debate, it's always going to be something for people in kind of privilege, white collar, kind of tech sort of jobs, where you basically, you've got the flexibility to sort of work a little bit less and work a bit more flexibly and get paid the same. So. Okay.
So it's it ends up being an interesting question about how the unskilled versus the skilled working lives pan out from here. There is an argument that what we call unskilled jobs are now the vital jobs, and in fact,
absolutely.
People going down to part-time, in fact, shows the level of their contribution, the level of necessity of their work. We're going to go to a different question now, and we'll come back to this in the questions from the audience and anything you want to add. Money. Something very strange has happened in that the government has suddenly found this extraordinary magic money tree and poured money into various people's pockets, various companies' pockets, in order to sustain them. The country now has a significant debt to which nobody seems to have addressed the question of how that is going to be paid off. And for those who've received money and those who have not received money, there's been a little bit of a kind of upheaval in who is worth being paid and who's not. Jill, you used to work at the Treasury. Are you there, Jill?
Yes.
I'm hoping. Yeah. Could you talk me through what you think will have happened the moment Rishi Sunak realised how much money he was going to need to pump into the economy?
Well, it was quite interesting because obviously in the sort of Cheltenham Festival week, as we know it, the sort of week before the government really got to grips with the scale of this, we had the budget, and the Chancellor announced what at the time seemed to be quite a big coronavirus package, which was £12 billion in the normal sort of scheme of things. That's quite big money in a budget. But by the end of the next week, when we were sort of moving towards lockdown, and he was moving to this really, quite amazing, when you think about it now, furlough scheme to pick up 80% of the wages of anyone who had to be furloughed to keep them sort of attached to their jobs, not on the unemployment register. He was starting to write checks which were running into sort of tens of billions per month, and now are clocking up as each month goes past, and he has to extend, because the Treasury's initial bet was this would be a very, what they call V-shaped problem, so that you would go very fast in, see a very big decline of GDP, but basically as soon as you got the virus under control, it was safe to come back out, everything would spring back to where it was. What's becoming clearer and clearer, and the problem for the Treasury, is that what that V shape is turning into quite a long sort of flat bottom, and it now becomes clear that the economy isn't going to recover, and it's certainly not going to bounce back immediately to the same sorts of levels that we saw. So there will be, down the line, there will be a lot of firms, small businesses going bust. A lot of, I think the Treasury's preoccupation at the moment is how to stop big firms going bust. So people who really just don't have enough cash coming in, how they're going to tide them through. And then at some point, there's going to have to be a reckoning that there may be jobs where we actually are going to see more people employed, but there are some sectors which are going to be reshaped quite dramatically. So if you imagine the sort of, hospitality sector, this time next year, if the virus is still a problem, that's one of the sort of issues. If we're still having to have social distancing in restaurants, if restaurants are having to operate at 30% capacity, do we have a big shakeout in that sector? So Sonia can go out for her expensive meal, but it will cost her quite a lot more. She will go out fewer times, and the workforce has gone down by 40, 50%. So I think it's quite interesting to see how this all plays out. And that's what the Treasury doesn't know at the moment. The huge benefit for the Treasury at the moment about stacking up this giant amount of debt is, one, it's not spooking the markets. One of the things that people in the Treasury are always worried about is, will we spook the markets if we suddenly look as though we're just writing checks to kingdom come? But the other thing is, and they have to hope it stays this way, because otherwise it will have very significant impacts, is that interest rates are incredibly low. If you're going to have to borrow loads of money, shed loads of money, which is what they're doing at the moment, printing money, actually, will you be able to repay it? Will you be able to do it? And at the moment, they don't think that's too much of a problem. So the Chancellor is hoping that things will start bouncing back, but we now hear that he's looking possibly to a July emergency budget to try and kick the economy back into action. But he's got other problems as well, because his tax revenues have fallen off a cliff, but he's also having to fund much more universal credit, these big schemes, but also down the line, a lot of people are saying, we want a much bigger state. We want a more protective state. We want a better funded NHS. We finally got to sort social care. Those are all things that will, down the line, cost big money permanently, not just for this sort of dip in and out.
Okay, so arguably we have shaken the magic money tree and we actually quite like what comes off it. There's something else that's happened, particularly in London. Bridget, I hope you've spent enough time in London to witness as well, and possibly also in the northeast, is that our roads became empty. The anger that environmentalists were feeling about how we were living suddenly dissolved, because nobody was driving, nobody was flying, we were still consuming, but in a rather different way. And we'd all kind of gone home and started living, at least for the height of lockdown, rather simpler lives. We discovered that Amazon could deliver. New cycle lanes are popping up in London. Do any of you think that the kind of this sort of resurgence of a kind of green spirit about this coronavirus lockdown will in any way last, or will in fact the realities of trying to get to work or trying to pay the bills or trying to run businesses just wipe out this moment?
I mean, I think there's probably a distinction to be made between London and the rest of the country in terms of how people would travel to work. So the vast majority of the people I represent rely on a car to get to work. Very, very small numbers of people commute by train. I think it's something like 0.5% of my constituents use a train to get to work.
Constituency?
Say again, sorry?
Just remind me of your constituency.
Sorry, in Sunderland, Houghton and Sunderland South. So a city, but we don't have any train lines running through it. We haven't had any train lines for any passenger rail services for over 40 years. So people either work locally or they'll usually use a car to get to work. So there just aren't the other options available to them. I think so I think there is already that kind of dynamic within transport in the country, and I think how we talk about public transport issues. So it's just not practical to use public transport in large parts of the country outside of London. It just doesn't take you where you need to be, where it's available at all, and it's very expensive often. I think.
But the interesting thing about Bridget's point, though, is that's a much more resilient transport structure and a way of getting to work than we see in the big cities, where people do depend very much on public transport. So, so we're already having cars coming back. I live right near the Bayswater Road in London. Normally, during lockdown, you couldn't hear any traffic noise. At the height of lockdown, it's great. You could just walk across the road without bothering to look for cars, apart from the guy that decided it was great to speed at 60 or 70, despite being a built-up area, because it was quite fun, because there's nothing else on there. But I think we've already lost a bit of that. But it's really quite interesting about how viable the city, and that's predominantly London, but also Newcastle has a metro system, Manchester and things, how viable our cities are and how they need to adjust to new working patterns when people don't want to go in on public transport and there isn't a car alternative. So in London, you can't really have a car alternative to commute into central London. That's just going to be gridlock. So can we sort of, through a mix of different things, find a different way of doing it? Or is this actually, the government's talked a lot about its levelling up agenda. It may not be up, but it might be sort of levelling out. Do we see people actually saying, well, actually, we need to be somewhere else where there are more options, where the transport structures are more resilient, and we're not all dependent on this big hub and spoke, sort of, sucking in economic activity from really big area, which has been the sort of rest of the country's problem about London and the southeast.
In a sense, Brexit was meant to be this levelling up agenda, but we seem to have got the levelling down through coronavirus. Sonia, did you want to make a point there?
Yeah, I'm quite I would like to be optimistic, but I'm quite sceptical actually. I live in sort of Zone 2 London. It already feels like traffic is kind of back to sort of approaching normal levels. It would be wonderful if more of the capital was pedestrianised and had exclusive cycle lanes, but I haven't seen any. So I am a bit sceptical. I think in terms of air travel as well and international travel, I think it will depend very much on kind of what the lasting impacts of the pandemic are in terms of social distancing requirements, for example. So I think if we get back to sort of relative normal in terms of being able to get on a plane and you don't have to have like 2 or 3 seats between people fairly quickly, and the demand for holidays is still there, so people haven't seen a massive drop to their incomes, I reckon we would go back to normal pretty quickly actually. But I think if, for example, airlines have to operate social distancing requirements for a lot longer, then I just don't think people are going to be able to afford air travel at the same level anymore. So I think you would see a reduction. So in terms of air travel, I think it kind of depends really on how long we're living with social distancing. And then I think in terms of, I think it also depends on what chunk of the population start to work from home on a more permanent basis. So, there are things I miss about being in an office 3 days a week, but at the same time, it's pretty great working from home all the time as well, if you're me, and not having to deal with the hour-long commute in both ways on really like sweaty and horrible trains that don't work and are inevitably delayed. And actually, if you add up all the time you spend commuting in London as a London commuter on public transport, it's quite significant, really. So, maybe people will opt to work from home more, and that might have an impact, I suppose, on emissions. But as Bridget said, I think that's quite a specifically London big metro area sort of thing.
Okay, there are more significant questions that come up when we think about the new normal. Some of those are related to our families and our relationships and how we interact, some of those related to tuition, learning, study and so forth. I'm hoping some of those will begin to come up in the questions. So if you could begin to prepare some of those questions. There is, we mentioned optimism, we mentioned pessimism. It feels like we are heading for a very long-term recession, and it is quite unusual in a recession to find a government that can maneuver a situation, find more money to dig us out of it. My instinct is that they are going to do everything they possibly can to snap us back into the old form. If there is resistance to this, I'm so sorry, I've got some chickens in the background because that's my current temporary normal. If they do try to snap us back into what we were, where do you think the points of resistance are? Who are the people who are going to resist most going back into their old ways of life? Sonia, have you got an idea?
Privileged, I think. So I think you're absolutely right that the government are trying to snap us back into the old pre-pandemic economic model. That's what they want to see. That's what works for Conservatives. And I think you can see that in terms of what they've prioritised. So, you know, the government's clearly taken a decision that social contact can go up a bit. And actually, I think from the moves that they've sort of briefed out, they've really sort of they've prioritise the economy too high compared to other things. So for example, the opening of non-essential retail, that's like a total political choice. The government could continue to keep non-essential retail workers furloughed, for example. That's an economic decision. We need to get the economy back on track. Whereas I think the government should be going more slowly, and it should be prioritising, for me, top priority is reopening schools, and then the second priority would be family relationships and social relationships. And then I would probably put the economy third, as long as the government provides proper financial protection for people who are kind of most affected. But that's clearly not what they're doing. And I think the most resistance will come from people who can afford to resist the government shifting us back to that model. So, you know, I return to this fact that I consider myself, and like, lockdown hasn't been massively easy in some ways. Like, I live by myself, like I won't see my partner for 5 months by the time he comes back, but like I still think like I'm incredibly privileged compared to some people, and I'm privileged enough to be able to keep myself safe, to be able to do my job from home. I don't have to put myself at risk. People who, you know, cannot afford to live without a wage in the sectors that the government are saying they should be reopening, they're going to have to go along with it, because they will become financially destitute if they don't. And the people who will resist are people who are in a financially privileged position, who can say, well, this relaxation might be happening, but actually I'm going to sort of, you know, I don't quite trust the government on this, and I'm going to kind of protect myself. So that's what I'm really worried about with the relaxation that we're seeing at the moment. It really is going to lead, I think, to a social differential in the extent to which people are able to protect themselves from the virus.
Bridget, what would you save, and what do you think is already being pushed out from the positives of the coronavirus lockdown?
I hope that we can reconsider the contribution that people can make outside of the kind of presentee office culture that is too apparent in so many sectors. But I'm conscious when I say that applies only to quite limited groups. And I suppose as well, it's hard to, you know, what we're living through at the moment is clearly not a normal kind of time. And I suppose there is a degree to which people's kind of fulfillment at work does depend on human interaction. And no matter how much I enjoy meeting colleagues on Zoom and having these kinds of conversations, there is something missing when you don't get to see people so much. So I think that is, you know, quite difficult. I mean, what worries me most coming out of this crisis is the prospect of very high levels of unemployment for a very long period of time, which is not something we've seen as a country for a very long time. I mean, even post financial crash, we didn't see the kind of sustained high levels of unemployment that we had in the 1980s and 1990s. And I'm not sure as a country that we are properly equipped to respond to that. I'm not sure that the government is doing the thinking that is necessary around how we respond as a country, that will require retraining, reskilling, the whole kind of programme around job creation that will be necessary, because we just don't have the experience of dealing with that kind of crisis. I suppose as well, for all its for many people, working from home has brought benefits. There is, I think, a concern around that unhelpful blurring between work and home life, that it is often harder for people to shut off, to carve out time for themselves, and to not feel pressured to work all of the time. So, you know, there's a good reason why trade unions have long fought to, you know, to have that kind of separation and to ensure people that have leisure time. So I just think we need to tread with care around that kind of protection for people's leisure time. But that said, we have realised, and the government, even the Conservative government, has realised that real benefits can come from working with the trade union movement. The TUC in particular have been absolutely central to shaping the government's response around furlough, and lots of other areas around, you know, safety at work. There's a lot still to do in that area, and I understand, you know, there is a real issue around how we enforce that, and where people being confident that they know where to go to report it. But I hope that we can see some of that artificial division around the role of trade unions, and you know, a Conservative government constantly having a pop at them, and actually recognise that they bring real expertise and recognition of the voice of workers in all of this too.
Jill, what would you say from this period, and what will the government?
What would I save?
Yeah.
I think Bridget was referring to earlier. I think sort of re-evaluation of who actually is critical in the economy is one of the most interesting things, because we've had this big debate about the government's new migration proposal and this sort of equation that low paid equals low skilled. And what we've now sort of realized is low paid very often means absolutely critical to the basic functioning of the economy, but perhaps under remunerated. So I think that's really quite an important thing. I think the other thing that I think was a bit of a shame was we had this sort of mass surge of we've had a lot of community volunteering, but we also had this mass sign up for the government's own big volunteering scheme. But then that sort of dissipated, and I think that was a real shame, because actually I think there was a sort of, you know, sort of slight rediscovery of people wanting to find ways of contributing. And then I think not taking people up on that offer was really a shame. But I mean, a lot of people I know have been volunteering in mutual aid groups at food bank, doing things to help their community. I think that was quite a good thing. I think the other thing that's really quite interesting to emerge was that if you can put your mind to it, you can do things. I mean, the fact when we saw Wuhan building hospitals in next to no time, we thought, well, they can do that in China, we'd never do it here. But although they didn't use them, they stood up these Nightingale hospitals incredibly quickly through a sort of big combined effort. You know, the homeless for a period disappeared from streets around where I live because we found a way of dealing with that. So I think actually it was quite a big sort of, you know, there've been huge numbers of problems, and I think, you know, as they say, lots of issues for the inquiry down the line. But a bit of a discovery that actually at the end of the day, only the state can really provide the ultimate insurance, and you need to sort of protect that capacity, I think was quite important. And the fact that actually you can do things. I mean, the fact that the furlough scheme and the self-employed scheme, universal credit, that actually payments have been made under these schemes is a really sort of slightly undersung achievement by the Treasury and HMRC. We focus a lot on the glitches, but there have been some really quite, you know, notable successes that you don't then notice because things didn't go wrong. It was quite possible these things would fall over and go badly wrong. There's loads of other things that may go wrong, but I think maybe a bit of rediscovery of the benefits of public services and stuff like that is actually a product of this.
But I've just got some questions beginning to tick in. If anybody else has got questions, do put them in. I do apologise about putting my hand in front of the screen, but I'm doing this off an iPhone due to technical issues. Jill, in no way my judgment on you, but would you be prepared to accept a lower wage and a lower social status for your work in order that those people who are actually doing the supposed unskilled jobs could actually rise in society?
Do I want a low wage and low? I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what social status I really have. I mean, you know, sort of random think tank pundit and, you know, former maybe failed civil servant. I'm not sure that that's the highest status thing. I think there's a really interesting question though, whether people like Sonia, Bridget, and I, who've all basically probably seen our spending go down I've certainly seen my spending go down during this period, but maintained our incomes, having not gone 3 days a week like Sonia did. Whether we should be prepared to pay significantly higher taxes to boost the salaries of some of these key workers and things like that. I think there's a very interesting question about whether the thing that's been absolutely taboo for quite a long time about paying higher taxes, higher contributions, actually is now back on the agenda. And I think that would probably be better than me going and negotiating. I mean, I'm not sure about the mechanism of transfer. If it was, will I take a pay cut so that the people that come in and clean our offices and stuff like that do it, then, that's going to be essential going back to work. So, yeah, okay, do that. But I think the question of higher taxes is now, potentially back on the agenda.
Yeah, the tax point is key, because actually, if you look at so-called austerity of the last 10 years, it was austerity of public spending cuts. And actually, Conservative chancellors have delivered huge income tax reductions, and corporation tax reductions over the last 10 years that have actually disproportionately benefited more affluent families. So I think the question of tax is really important, and absolutely I would be prepared to pay more tax. And quite frankly, I think paying more tax to go towards a health service and free personal care is a complete and utter no-brainer. And in some ways, I just think it's such an easy political case to make, actually. I think you would just join up the social care budget with the NHS budget. Gordon Brown's, penny on national insurance to pay for the NHS was one of the most popular tax rises in history. Something like 80% of the public supported it in its way. It's easy to make a political case for taxing people more to pay for better public services if you include the word NHS in it. You just got to have people who are, it's not ideological anathema to do that. And I think that's where we've gone wrong with this Conservative government.
Okay, I'm going to go to some of the questions. One which has just made me smirk, which popped in, was, are journalists essential to the economy? But a second question, which is...
I've definitely got something to say about that.
I'm going to tag a second question onto that. The furlough scheme is masking what is likely high unemployment rate. And as Jill said, it's likely that some of these jobs might not return. At the same time, we have a huge digital skills gap in the UK. How do we motivate people to retrain and reskill? And what role should the government play in that? And that's from Venus. And anybody who's been watching the media scene will also see there's been a load of layoffs recently. Go on, Sonia.
So should I take the journalism question? So I'm not sure about the economy, but I think it's a really critical aspect of democracy. I think journalism, and obviously journalism as an industry has its high points and its low points, like most industries, but I do think it's absolutely critical to a proper functioning of democracy. I think we've seen that actually even in the last few weeks in terms of trying to hold the government to account for its pandemic strategy, holding the government to account for the conduct of Dominic Cummings, for example, which is far more than just about the behaviour of one man, but about hypocrisy, and hypocrisy at the heart of government and the heart of power. So I do think a thriving journalism, a thriving media industry is really critical and important to the functioning of democracy, even though we as an industry will sometimes get some things wrong.
Okay, do we want to be retraining people in digital skills? And this again goes back to this question of who has proved essential at this point in time, those digital skills or those who can get in a car and deliver things. Bridget, what do you think?
I think we will require a major response from the government around responding to the fact that we are going to be facing, as I said earlier, very high levels of sustained unemployment. I think we don't have much to refer to with, in this country other than probably the Future Jobs Fund a decade ago that the Labour government created in the aftermath of the financial crisis that worked very well. So I think that's not a bad place to start. Other European countries are a bit further ahead already in terms of looking at the options that they would have around retraining and reskilling. I mean, that goes hand in hand with the fact that over the last decade, we've seen a hollowing out of the further education sector. So lots of people who, want to get back, want to retrain, want to get the skills they perhaps didn't have the opportunity to gain at school, particularly acute in communities like mine, have already found it hard to access those kinds of opportunities to reskill. So we already face quite a big gap around skills in this country that I suspect the pandemic will kind of exacerbate. So there is a big question, I think, for government around what that retraining job creation scheme will look like. You know, it is clear that because of necessary social distancing, some sectors of the economy will just not return to the same level of economic activity for some time. I think what's also worrying is that if you look at, I think, the way in which consumer demand will lack confidence if there's not proper, you know, if the public don't have confidence in the government's test, track and isolate scheme, even if you know, retail, for example, starts to reopen in a much bigger way, I think it will be hard to persuade people that it's safe to go back unless they have confidence that the government's got a grip on the testing regime. And I think there are big questions about how they're handling that will again further dampen demand within the economy.
I think this is quite a big, I mean, it potentially could be quite a big opportunity. The other thing that we haven't mentioned but is coming down the road is the ending of free movement from the EU. We know that there'll be sort of, you know, potential labour shortages in some key areas where we've been very dependent. The government, you know, is, I think, probably very keen to have a big infrastructure programme as one of its responses to coronavirus, to get construction going. But we also know when we won the Olympics, we basically had to import all the skills to build the Olympic Stadium. The Olympic Stadium was fundamentally built by, you know, imported labour. There's going to be much less of that because I think, you know, we're going to see quite a big reduction in mobility anyway. The UK won't, I think, be a great, you know, necessarily popular destination. So I think it's a really interesting thing. We haven't talked at all about the desire to, you know, have a greener recovery. Boris Johnson said that, Rishi Sunak said that, so let's hold them to that. You know, we need to massively sort of build capacity if we're going to retrofit housing and all those sorts of things. So I think it's really interesting to think about what are the future needs of the economy and how can we actually give people who maybe haven't had the opportunity to get those sorts of jobs in the past, those opportunities now going forward. And if this can give a real impetus to that, I think that could be one of the better things to come out of it. And we've also seen, you know, a big surge in people who want to apply to be nurses. You know, we've had this thing where we've had this very odd model where we don't train our own nurses. We sort of rely on basically free riding on training provided by the rest of the world. So can we offer more opportunities there? So I think it's really interesting to see how this might change our labour force model. And maybe even might finally start to see UK productivity picking up a bit, which was the big problem out of the financial crisis, was that basically we've had appalling productivity growth for the past decade and a bit.
Okay, we've got another question here from Loretto Branford. Will social care, especially care for the elderly, finally get the same attention as the NHS as a political, social and economic issue? And as so many carers came from the EU, what will be the Brexit impact? Did you catch that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Who's it for, or is it for any of us?
Sonia, why didn't you have a go?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, but I'm quite pessimistic about social care finally getting the attention that it deserves, because I actually think the sort of crisis that is unfolded in our care homes is a symptom of something kind of deeper in our society, which is a real reluctance to talk properly about ageing and what that implies and have a good conversation about how we as a society should care for older people. It's sort of this thing that's kind of been swept under the carpet that no one really thinks about until they get to the stage of needing care or their relative gets to the stage of needing care. And I think it is partly a lack of political bravery. So I think solutions exist in terms of funding, for example. So I personally think free personal care is a complete no-brainer, and the case for free personal care, social care, is actually stronger than the case for free healthcare, because actually you're much less likely to save for something you need in the last 5 years of life than something that might affect you at any time, like your health. So I think there is a stronger case for socialising the costs of free personal care and doing it through general taxation. But I do think that one of the reasons why we haven't got to a solution, and I think one of the reasons for the lack of political bravery, is that there is just an endemic ageism in society. And, you know, I think we all fear ageing so much, and we fear our own aging, and it's not one of those things that we like talking about. And that contributes to this sort of social sense that aging is just about kind of decline and physical and mental decline, and that actually care at the end of life is all about managing that physical and mental decline. So it's a really kind of awful sort of culture that, I mean, there are some care providers obviously that did kind of completely amazing work against the odds and against the ageism that is in society, but I think we start from completely the wrong starting point. Instead of saying, you know, well, what does a social care system look like that enables older people who may be experiencing some physical and mental decline, but that doesn't mean that they're not capable of living rich, flourishing lives filled with love. What would a system that supports that and like that sort of end of life look like? And we never ask that question. It's always quite a superficial debate about funding, and we never even really solve the funding. That the symptom of that is the funding. It's also the fact that care is low paid, considered to be low skill work, when actually done well, it's incredibly highly skilled work. But I honestly think we are never going to fix this until we sort of take a look at ourselves as a society and say, how are we going to do ageing differently? And I really feel like the way that older people have been treated through this pandemic is a real symptom of that. And I don't feel like it's not prompting a different kind of conversation, is what I feel.
I would have thought, on excluding the care homes, I would have thought it has prompted a different conversation, and that we are now aware of the elderly in our community, what help we can give them day to day, the fact that they do like their freedom, the fact that most people over 70 are perfectly vibrant, love going out, and that we do not just sort of cut the line off at 70 and say, oh, well, sorry, that's it, you're on your way out. I was rather surprised by that. We've got another question which comes from Marie Leconte, who was the organiser of this panel, and this one's to Bridget. And she asks, do you think there will be a change in attitudes towards the gig economy and jobs with little or no safety net? Is this something Labour is looking at?
I mean, I think the pandemic has exposed a lot of the vulnerability that exists within our economy. So many of those employed in the gig economy who find that they have very few rights at work. I think it also demonstrates that part of the reason that women are so vulnerable to losing their jobs during this crisis is partly because much of the growth in self-employment has been amongst women, and that's often most at risk, you know, at this time. I think it does, you know, many of the arguments that we've made, albeit unsuccessfully electorally, in the last 10 years or so, has been touching on the fact that, you know, far too much work has become casualised, without proper rights, without proper recognition or pay. But that's not to say that coming out of this, we don't just move on and forget all about it. I think there will be a real need to make and win those kinds of arguments about not only recognising the contribution of key workers, and that's absolutely vital, but also seeking to reshape the way in which we regard people's relationship with work. You know, universal credit, for example, has been exposed as being wholly inadequate in responding to very real drops that people have seen in income. I mean, you know, there's been a massive increase in the number of claims through universal credit, so the system has coped in that regard. But I dealt with far too many families who have found themselves just pushed into destitution almost because the system just does not allow them to maintain a decent standard of living. So I think it does demonstrate that our social security system is not working, and that is in the much broader sense. And, you know, people like the Child Poverty Action Group and the IPPR are doing a lot of work on what that future system would look like. But I think that has to go hand in hand with proper rights in the workplace. And also, as I was saying earlier, a reappraisal of the role of the trade union movement in society. You know, they're seeing big growth in membership across the last year. We've seen, you know, growth in people joining a trade union recently. And I think a recognition that they have a role to play in bringing the voice of workers and, you know, allowing those voices that are not otherwise heard, even in Westminster, or even, you know, not always heard in the media, to get that kind of attention for once. So I think there is an understanding about the fact that there is changes needed. Whether that happens, I think it's a question of political will.
Okay, we're going to go back to the original question of the new normal. In a sense, I'd quite like you to just try and think and paint a picture of how you think we could, in 6 months' time, have transformed society for the better with just tangible human examples what it is. And if you're in the audience, would you also manage just jot down in the question section any ideas you have about what you would like to see persist, and if you've got any idea about how we can carry it out, how do we do it? Sonia, what would you like to see happening in 6 months' time?
So I think more people working from home, if you can, for some of the week, is not a bad thing. I think working less for everyone, but I think that would have to and more emphasis on kind of spending time with family and on your relationships. But I think that has to be predicated on improving terms and conditions for lower paid workers. So that's really important. And to be honest, consuming less, like, I'm really not excited about non-essential retail opening up, and I won't be going to the shops to buy stuff like, you know, clothes, because I feel like actually this has helped remind me I've got enough clothes. I mean, I don't even need really new clothes because I'm not seeing anyone. I'm perfectly happy for my consumption to dip, and you know, that obviously has implications for GDP and it's more environmentally sustainable. But I think the big macroeconomic question that comes out of that is it could be much better for the environment if we see GDP dipping it, if people are spending more time on things that matter to them rather than time on like buying stuff that matters to them. But the big rider of that is that then we have to redistribute what we have much more fairly. So people like me who can afford to pay more taxes should be paying a greater proportion of our income in taxes to fund good services for other people and for income supplements for other people, because obviously consuming less means that there are going to be, you know, fewer jobs in the service sector, for example.
Jill, what sort of magic would you like to see happening in about 6 months' time?
I'm trying to think, when is 6 months' time? It's December, isn't it? So just heading into Christmas and potentially Brexit. It may not be the best time to pick. I mean, the big uncertainty is what is the normal then, because we don't know whether it's going to be like now, whether we'll have been through a second lockdown and things like that as possible in the autumn. So we really don't know where we're heading. But what I think would be good, and I thought it was a bit disappointing with Sonia saying that, you know, social care will go back onto the back burners. I think it would be really interesting if we emerge from this. I'm not sure if this is going to be just for the government, because the government's, you know, rather preoccupied at the moment and may not be the place to be doing original thinking. But I think what would be interesting would be if there could be sort of, you know, much more of an impetus to find some collective solutions to some of the sort of very big problems that we know have been flaws in the way we run things, and actually have spent some of this sort of time when we're, you know, not going out consuming, not doing all of these things, focusing very much on actually where do we want to go. I think Jonathan Powell wrote a thing the other day about, do we need a sort of, you know, post-COVID beverage commission to be thinking about some big ideas of how do we want to reorientate things. And I think that would be quite an interesting thing to be doing, to use that time, because you're not going to be able to, you're going to be still running hand to mouth for this period and trying to invent policy to go along. It would be great to have a bigger sense of direction of where do we want to go. And I would include in that people like journalists proving their worth to the economy by holding government's feet to the fire on things like, you know, social care wasn't just a problem in April and May, it's been a long-term problem and you really do need to sort it out now.
Okay, I've just got one contribution from one of the our Trouble members who said that she would like to see, this is Sarah, she said she'd like to see continued community spirit. Everyone now says hello in my street. We have a street WhatsApp group with just about everyone in on it, and everyone is so much more friendly. Now, whether we sustain that for 6 months, but this has got nothing to do with the economy, it's got nothing to do with jobs, but it has got to do with quality of life in your local area and who you interact with on a daily basis. Bridget, where would you like to see things in 6 months' time, other than with Keir Starmer in charge?
Well, of course. I think, you know, as I've touched on already, I hope that employers will think again about the contribution that workers can make on a more flexible basis, and to not treat workers who ask for slightly different arrangements for a range of reasons, whether it's caring responsibilities or whatever it might be, as kind of lesser workers, that they have a contribution to make, and you know, we can be more accommodating if we need to be. I also noticed that, you know, we see more families out, you know, kind of with kids on bikes and scooters out for walks. How do we make sure that, I mean, admittedly it'll be in the middle of winter in 6 months' time. I think, how do we make sure that, you know, some of that improvement I think we've seen in, you know, allowing people to kind of enjoy being outside a bit more and exercise, that we can continue to support that, and also just make it safer and easier for people to do that and to feel encouraged to do so. I suppose the downside in terms of what it will mean for families with children is, you know, for those children who've been out of school for what is a very long period of time in their lives, that again will have a disproportionate impact on some of the most disadvantaged children in our society. So, you know, we know that school makes a big impact in narrowing those kinds of inequalities. Children have missed that. How do we put something in place that addresses, you know, the additional barrier that will be there, and allow some of those children to catch up? What kinds of extra help will children need to get back to where they are? Because, you know, too many children, particularly from poorer backgrounds, already arrive months, if not years behind some of their more affluent peers. And, you know, what I don't want is for this pandemic to further accelerate some of those trends.
Okay, we've got one more contribution, which is from Kevan, another member, who says the economy depending less on consumerism is what she'd like to see in December, which is obviously sad news for all those Christmas retailers. More sustainable living and government policy to be more sustainable. The next question is, if we do all have these visions of a new normal, how do we create them in this particular environment? Because it strikes me that you have a government at the moment that is pressing ahead on an emergency agenda, and there is not much space to change direction. Do we have to look away from government for that to happen? Bridget.
I think some of it shows that, you know, the collective action and collective pressure that can be brought to bear, where enough people work towards, feel a certain way or work towards a certain goal. You know, the furlough scheme, for example, didn't just happen. It happened because there was pressure brought to bear and a recognition that the consequences of not taking that kind of action would have been significant. So it is, you know, even within constraints, it is possible to exert that kind of political change. But I think some of the changes that we've been talking about, you know, government can provide additional support to make some of that happen. But, you know, working as communities, you know, working as groups of individuals, we can often achieve real change and you know, demonstrate that, you know, positive benefits as some of this can bring. I mean, clearly it's easier when you've got government on your side providing some of that kind of support and infrastructure, but you know, communities can make positive change too.
Okay, Sonia, should we turn to the government to make this, or should you and Jill join the barricades together and start the revolution for the next 6 months?
I mean, I don't think we can just rely on government, but I think, you know, a lot of the stuff around kind of civic society, like that will rely on a lot of us. I think particularly actually on stuff like social care. I do think you can blame the government to some extent, but I do think what we see, as I said, is a symptom of kind of like societal ageism. So like, I think there's a lot that we can do. But at the end of the day, government is really key and it has like key levers. And so I do think that putting pressure on the government to do things differently. And I think actually what Bridget said, you know, about the way that the TUC kind of acted to really get some good wins from the government on the furlough scheme and other aspects of kind of its economic response, that's really important. And I do think, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this government is sort of, you know, going into sort of typical, you know, before we went into this pandemic, we had all this stuff about levelling up and this is going to be a different kind of conservative government, etc., etc. I think now there's obviously a bit of a sort of, you know, there's clearly tensions within the cabinet, and that, you know, there are some for whom, you know, they're really worried about rising debt, and they, you know, that they think another round of austerity is imminent. But I do think that there are, you know, there are divisions there, and so it would be good to sort of, it would be, I think, you know, the TEC has played a bit of a blinder, and it goes to show what can happen actually when you put pressure on the government in the right way.
Okay, and Jill, you are now.
I think the interesting one of the interesting things, I think there's been an interesting thing about the sort of differentiation and competition between the UK government, which for most purposes, not on the economic side, but on the health side is the government of England and the other devolved governments. But I think the other interesting thing has been the sort of increasing profile of some of the mayors speaking for their regions. I mean, Andy Burnham's been doing quite a lot, Andy Street from the West Midlands, the Conservatives, Sadiq Khan, obviously in London. And I think one of the really interesting things is, does this lead to a bit of a sort of rediscovery of local government, which has been starved of funds for a very large extent? I mean, it's taken by far the biggest brunt of austerity over the last whatever, and do actually people start to notice local government again, think local government could do things, a central government think that actually having, you know, functioning local government is quite helpful? And can actually local governments help catalyse more locally appropriate solutions than a sort of one size fits all?
Okay, so Jill, this is the last question. Rishi Sunak's emergency budget in July, I'm giving it to you to spend. What would you spend on now so that point in December something has changed?
Well, I hope he's spending more than half a second thinking about what he's doing, because this is obviously going to be quite big. But I think that some of the things he's going to have to do is he's probably have to do something about sort of pay in some of the sort of less well-off bits of the public sector. I think he's going to have to put aside some money to sort out social care financing, not least because I think they'd like to see a wave of bankruptcies among some of the private providers because of the effects of losing a lot of their residents at the sort of most brutal. I think he's going to put a lot of money into retraining, and I think we'll hear big things about infrastructure. But the interesting things, it's very easy to announce big money for infrastructure. It's much harder to actually get those things off the ground. So I think he'll be, you know, the dreadful word that we always use in the financial crisis was stuff that's shovel ready. So I think they need to be starting to think actually what are things they can get off the ground quite quickly. I also thought on the working with the trade unions, I never thought I'd hear a Johnsonian government talking about social partners. I thought that was too European and just too sort of, you know, 1960s Harold Wilson corporatism for them. But it was quite nice actually for this to be a collective effort.
Good. Okay, so that is the question of the new normal. We're going to come and look back on this conversation in 6 months' time and find out who predicted the weather correctly and whether indeed anything has changed or whether the forces that were will become the forces that are again. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Jill, to Bridget and to Sonia and to all the audience. I've seen some of your names flicker up on screen. Hello to all of you that I know personally I haven't seen for ages and ages. And we've got a few more meetings booked in the diary. Do please have a look at the Trouble Club website. And I'm hoping that we will all be able to meet in person very slowly and gradually over the summer in some fashion or another. Thank you all. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.